So I will tell you at the outset that it's actually going to be fairly easy to be in compliance with coordinating board rules on this because we don't have any. Okay, but we are thinking about it, in particular, particularly the funding issue that surrounds this. And so I will talk about that, but and I will warn you that this presentation will probably seem like a series of somewhat disjointed, rambling thoughts about CBE and PLA. And if it seems that way, it's because that's exactly what it is. Okay? And what this is going to reflect is the thoughts that I've had about this since the whatever rules or guidelines are developed around competency-based education and prior learning assessment, and the funding and the funding issue, for that matter, that come out of the coordinating board will probably originate in my division. So I have to think about this at least a little bit, or I have to assign somebody to think about it, and then I can think about what they've thought about, and so on. So this reflects conversations that I've had with folks internally, but also externally. I mean, this was actually kind of fortuitous, I guess, but I had or almost serendipitous, but I had a conversation with a guy who's, and I forget who he works for, some think tank somewhere, who's writing a report on all this stuff. And so I had a telephone conversation with him the other day about sort of this very subject, about what is it that as a state agency that has responsibility for oversight of higher education in Texas, what are we looking at in terms of CBE and PLA? So, let's see. Okay. Oh, there it goes. Oh, dang, it works. I will have to, I will admit that I got my, ever how old she is, my youngest daughter, who I think is 21. Well, she's right around there somewhere. Has a college degree, moved back home. So somehow I wish she'd learned some competencies so that, anyway. That's a whole other issue, but she helped me with this. I had to get her to tell me last night. I said, so how do you do these fly-in things again? Okay, and so she fixed. So we'll talk, so first of all, I'll talk a little bit about competency-based education and the conversations that we've had surrounding that. And so what is it? Well, we tend to think of competency-based education, variously described as the latest fad in higher education and so forth. But, you know, part of what I contend is that competency, or that education, at least higher education, has been competency-based for roughly 4,000 years. I think that goes back to Plato's Academy, more or less. And that in some way or another, competency-based education has always been with us. And we have always tried to measure whether students are competent at what they're doing or not in various and sundry forms. Oftentimes, definitions of competency-based education juxtapose seat time versus some other time. Okay, and I don't know about you, but and I did, as a college student, I did have a class or two from time to time that part of the grade was around attendance and participation. But I've never had a college class where even anything approaching 50% of the final grade was based on the fact that you'd parked your butt in a seat. Okay? So it's a little bit misleading then to make the argument that somehow we're going to substitute seat time with this other time. Because part of that seat time involves, whether we like it or not, involves sitting there and trying to learn something so you can demonstrate competence in it somehow, some way. All right? So all I can tell you is what I believe competency-based education is not. I'm not sure I can tell you what it is. And somewhere, somebody in the coordinating board actually developed a definition for this, but I couldn't find it yesterday. So It's one of those things that's been kicked around, but it has no official imprint on it yet. So what is it? Well, is it really just old wine in a new bottle? Or is it the next big thing in higher ed? Okay. And higher education goes through, like everything else in this life, higher education goes through fads. I spent 20 years at Austin Community College, and so one morning I was crossing the street. For those of you who know this, I was crossing the street at Rio Grande campus. My office was in the Attaché building. Some of you will remember the Attaché building. I was crossing the street, and there was this student sitting on the curb on the other side of the street. I was going toward the Rio Grande building going to class. And this student had on a pair of polyester bell-bottoms. And I started having flashbacks. Okay. I mean, for a couple of minutes there, I was reliving the 60s and the 70s. All right. And I actually stopped and asked this student, where did she get these things? And, had she gotten them at some thrift store or, no, they were brand new. She'd bought them at, I don't know, Dillard's or someplace. And so they had come back. Right? Now, fashion world knows this happens all the time, right? For those of us who have to wear ties a lot, then they go from thin to wide, and stripes are in, dots are in, so on and so on, okay? And higher education is no different in the sense that we run through a lot of fads from time to time. So is this the next fad, or does it really have some staying power to it? And we'll talk a little bit about how it could possibly actually have some real staying power to it. Okay. So part of the issue that surrounds competency-based education is how do you measure this somehow? And part of the idea behind competency-based education is this notion that we're going to shift how we measure what students are doing. And part of this revolves around the notion of direct assessment versus indirect assessment. And so a lot of people now have the idea that indirect assessment, for example, has now become virtually useless. Although, frankly, there are some things where indirect assessment may be the only way that we can get at it, at least up to a certain point. And I was thinking about this last night, and I had one of the things that my division is currently looking into is whether the state of Texas needs another vet school or not. And so a couple of my staff members went to A&M and visited the vet school there. They have a brand new $150 million facility. There's some really interesting things there. I had no idea that, as in human medical stuff, there's also simulation now for animal science as well. Now, they don't quite have the sim cow yet. Because they got a sim cow? I mean, that would be kind of fascinating, right? But they have a lot of stuff they can simulate. So I was thinking about this whole idea of assessment, direct versus indirect. And the truth of the matter is that when we're training medical doctors, we really want to practice a whole lot of indirect assessment before we ever get to the point we're going to directly assess them. I mean, just think about surgery, for example, right? We really want a lot of indirect assessment before we ever get to the direct assessment piece of it. So indirect assessment certainly has a role to play, even in those things that we consider to be sort of hands-on. Right? And as a cardiac surgeon once put it to me, this was years and years ago when my dad, 1984 in fact, so that's been a long time ago, when my dad had bypass surgery. And so I was talking to the cardiac surgeon after the surgery was over, and I guess it was his last surgery of the day or something, because he seemed to have time on his hands. And we were chatting, and I was in graduate school, and I was telling him about what I was doing. And he was very impressed by the fact that I was getting a PhD. And I said, or I was working on one, and I said, I'm kind of impressed by the fact that you're a cardiac surgeon. That sounds pretty. And he said, this is just sophisticated Voctec stuff. He says, I'm just taking them apart and putting them back together. And I thought, well, yeah, but I really hope you're good at it. And it turns out he was. I mean, my dad had bypass surgery in 1984 or whatever that was, and he's still alive and has never had to go back for a touch-up, which is, what I understand, is very unusual to go that long. So he's done something right since then, and the surgeon did something right then, okay? But so assessment itself, both of these have their place. And one of the things that you hear about CBE all the time is that it's all going to be characterized by direct assessment. Because we're going to get away from the indirect assessment of competencies based on multiple choice tests or so forth. But I would argue that what constitutes direct is also a function of the field you're in. Okay, so if you're in a literature major, then your competency, a direct assessment of that, is certainly your ability to write an essay, to write a critique of a piece of literary work, to write a piece of literature yourself. Right? And so in that particular field, sometimes the things that we sometimes think of as indirect assessment in another field is actually the direct assessment in that field. So part of what we need to do is make sure we don't get confused about the value of either one of these particular methods. And as I said, direct assessment is sometimes necessary. Indirect assessment is also sometimes very useful. And it is not always possible to use direct assessment, at least immediately. One of the things that's revolutionizing to some extent at least, the nursing world is the use of simulation. You know, the great bugaboos to solving the nurse shortage have always been clinical space and faculty, right? And they still are. I was really struck in the last legislative session by all the arguments about letting community colleges offer baccalaureates in nursing because somehow that would solve the nursing shortage. And while I don't have a problem with community colleges offering baccalaureates, merely letting them offer nursing degrees is not going to solve the nursing shortage. Okay? Because until you have enough faculty and enough clinical space to support it, then you're not going to get around, you're not going to solve the problem. And simulation, though, helps solve the clinical space problem to some extent. Now, we still don't have any idea how to solve the faculty shortage. Actually, I have a proposal on my desk that would actually try to do some of that, but and we'll see how that works out. Okay, so direct assessment, indirect assessment, both of them have their place. And both of them can be very useful in trying to determine whether students actually know what they're doing or not. Okay, so prior learning assessment. This is, as Mike alluded to, there's a lot of confusion around this sometimes about competency-based education versus prior learning assessment. And I don't want to speak ill of my boss, but sometimes the Commissioner of Higher Education confuses these things. And it took me months to figure out that every time he was, telling me about competency-based education, what he really meant was prior learning assessment. And once I figured that out, then everything he'd been telling me for 9 months kind of fell into place. I'm going, I got it now. Silly me for not picking up on this a lot earlier. But, I thought when he said one thing, I thought that's what he meant. But, who knows? Okay. But he's not alone in this. Okay. There are an awful lot of people who sometimes confuse the two and think they're exactly the same thing. Right? And they're not. Right? Competency-based education is this effort to measure your mastery of learning outcomes by judging whether you're really competent in them or not. And direct assessment has a play in this because the notion is that the more directly you can assess it, the greater your ability to determine whether students know it or not. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, by the way. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. But prior learning assessment is the idea that you are going to take the existing knowledge that folks have, knowledge and skills, and through some kind of assessment mechanism, you're going to give them credit for this. And this has been done in various places by a lot of different, and there's a lot of different mechanisms for doing this. Where it gets connected to competency-based education is because people will say, well, and the best way to conduct prior learning assessment is by a direct assessment. And that may very well be true. I mean, for example, if someone comes into an automotive program and says, well, you know, I've been working for, what is it, the AMCO, the largest, supposed to be the biggest transmission place in the world, right? And so he says, well, I've been working at AMCO for 10 years and so forth, and so I know transmissions. Now, I don't know anything about brakes, but I know about transmissions. Well, if you want to directly assess that, well, you just say, well, here's a broken transmission, fix it. And then watch to see if they can fix it. And that would be a direct assessment of that person's competency regarding transmissions, right? Then you give them credit for it. And this kind of thing has been going on in the world of career and technical education for a long, long time. As Mike pointed out earlier, a lot of departments have always given what are often referred to as challenge exams. For example, a student comes in and says, hey, I know this stuff. And you say, okay, well, here's an exam for it. A direct assessment of that would be, particularly those things like automotive where you can actually demonstrate this. Nursing, you know, there's a big push on to give a lot of prior learning assessment and then grant credit to veterans, for example. So how many of you have heard of Credit for Heroes? All right, so the idea is you take a military occupational specialty and the skills and knowledge that are a part of that MOS, you map that to work activities or to skills and knowledge that are mapped to courses. And then you know, and usually what you do is you just directly transfer that across because you assume that if they had that training, they learned something. This has been done in police academies and firefighting institutes for a long, long time, where a student comes in and says, well, I went to, you know, firefighting school and I'm a certified firefighter. And so for someone in an AAS program, for example, they'll be given 12 or 15 hours of credit for what they took in that academy. Okay. Prior learning assessment is not new. When I taught as an adjunct at St. Edward's University starting in 1988, I believe it was, they were already doing prior learning assessment in a big, big way through a completion program. And they did prior learning assessment in things like anthropology. Okay, and they did it through a portfolio method. So that's one way of conducting prior learning assessment. So there's a lot of connections between CBE and prior learning assessment, but they're not necessarily the same thing. You can have a program that will give students all of the credit they're worthy of getting on entry into the program through some kind of prior learning assessment and never have anything else in your department directly connected to competency-based education, and vice versa. You can simply not give anybody any prior learning credit but have your entire program connected to competency-based education somehow. But they can be closely related, and I'll talk about why that might be important in a moment. So some of the challenges associated with CBE that we think about a lot of times is how do you convert learning outcomes to competencies? Okay. Now, you know, I think part of the problem is that most institutions are still struggling with how to create learning outcomes in the first place. So we're still trying to figure out how do you create a decent learning outcome and how do you assess that. And then we want to, and now all of a sudden somebody says, well, now you need to convert all that into competencies. It's not real clear to me that there's actually a huge distinction between the two. And I think sometimes we scare people off by making the argument, well, they're radically different things. Well, no, I'm not sure they are. Just as I'm not real sure that there's something radically different between a learning outcome and what we used to call, what do we used to call them? Course objectives. Right? I mean, oftentimes, you just, you know, it's a matter of language. And a course objective becomes a student learning outcome, oftentimes by the fact that you've just restated it. You've put it in a different language, it's a little bit different nomenclature. Same thing can occur with trying to figure out what your competencies are. And just as learning outcomes are the sort of recognized by the fact that they can be measured somehow, as opposed to a course objective which was not always clearly measurable. Learning outcomes are clearly measurable, or so are competencies. So I think there's probably a much closer relationship there than you imagine, but that's one of the challenges. And then how do you demonstrate the mastery of this? And I think this is a place, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in connection with the affordable baccalaureate. But how do you demonstrate that mastery? This goes back to direct assessment versus indirect assessment. What is the best way to do that? And then also whether that is a one-by-one process or is it a cumulative process at the end. Remember final exams? Okay, final exams were supposed to be designed in such a way that they actually reflected the total of your learning across the semester. All right? And when you get into competency-based education, one of the issues that you're going to confront is, so is mastery a function of, okay, I have demonstrated my competency in 1, and now 2, and then 3, and then 13, and 28, and 87, or however many you have? Or is there some mechanism by which you want the student to demonstrate all of those competencies? Capstone courses are supposed to be able to do that. Okay? And good ones usually manage to incorporate the majority of those. It's very difficult to create any kind of assignment that doesn't last a couple of years that's going to create that. But this competency-based thing, I told somebody one time, I said, I think a dissertation is a classic example of competency-based education that's also supposed to be some reflection of what you've learned over your sum total of your program. Okay? Because you can either do one or you can't. So how do you demonstrate mastery in this? And on a very practical level, how are we going to pay faculty for this kind of stuff? Faculty load is a huge issue. And somehow you have to convince faculty that out of all of this conversion from seat time to whatever, that they're not going to wind up doing a whole lot more for the same amount of money or less. Yeah, and that's a real concern. And that's something that every administration, from department chairs on up, really needs to seriously think about how they're going to address this issue. And there's a lot of ways to do it based around numbers of students, based around numbers of hours involved, and so forth. But at some point, you're going to have to figure out how do you make this an equitable situation so that you're not simply demanding more for less from faculty. Okay, so let's see, what have I strayed too far? There we go. So, Texas Affordable Baccalaureate. Okay, so how many of you have heard of this? This was originally a challenge put out by that esteemed vice presidential candidate Rick Perry. Okay, right? So you've all heard this, right? I mean, at one point, he said that, Trump was the bozo of the world or something to that effect. But all of a sudden yesterday, Trump wasn't nearly as bad as he thought he was. And in fact, he's so good that I would be proud to serve as his vice president. And now, I don't want to give my own politics away, but somehow I think those two probably deserve each other. But anyway, but I mean, my own politics lean very much toward the libertarian side, but neither one of those are those things. I mean, I don't really know what Perry is, but I'm pretty sure that Trump is not a libertarian. In political science, he's what we would call a right populist. Okay, but although on some days he's more like a left populist, depending on which speech he's given. But anyway, so the Texas Affordable Baccalaureate had this genesis with Rick Perry's office, who said, you guys need to figure out how to give a bachelor's degree for $10,000 or less. And there were a lot of attempts at this made around the state. Most of them, most of the ones that I saw, and I was involved in one in the Permian Basin when I was at Midland College. And what made it $10,000 or less was because the student went to a community college for the first 2 years, and none of their expenses there were counted. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, you know, I'm a political scientist, and so math is not really my strong suit, but you know, even I can figure out that this doesn't really add up the way it's supposed to add up and you know, everybody just kind of said, well, just stand over there and be quiet, kind of thing. So now the Texas Affordable Baccalaureate has recently been resurrected. There will be an RFA or an RFP, I forget which one it is, coming out very soon if they haven't already released it. The idea was to release it before the end of April, and I think we missed that. But you know, time is a relative thing. And I don't know that we ever specified which April we were going to do. You know, I used to have this facilities guy that we were going through a lot of construction, and every time you ask him something, he'd say, well, it'd be a couple of weeks. And it's like, well, you know, and after a while, you know, and finally I had to ask him, I said, you know, you say this about everything. He said, what? And he said, well, yeah, he said, I have never ever specified which couple of weeks I was talking about. And I said, well, yeah, okay, Dennis, you got a point. You never did. I said, but could you start doing that now? It might be helpful. So same kind of thing. We should have this out soon, but it will provide some grants and seed money for folks who are interested in trying to develop an affordable baccalaureate. An affordable baccalaureate will be defined roughly as $15,000 or less. So it used to be 10, but you know, inflation being what it is and so forth, we're going to go for 15,000 or less. What we sort of assume from this is that there will be some connection to competency-based education. And why is that? And that's because everybody thinks of competency-based education as a faster way to get through, right? I mean, and we all have the stories of the guy from Commerce, Texas A&M Commerce, I think it is, right? Who got his bachelor's degree in 2 semesters or something. And now he did this mainly because he got a lot of credit through PLA. He actually knew a lot when he went into this thing, and he didn't have anything else to do except work on this degree. Okay. And he was very dedicated and very self-motivated. And so he was quite willing to sit there and work on this stuff 12, 15 hours a day. And he could do that. So he was in a somewhat of a unique position for most students that we know of, right? Okay, so he could do all this stuff, and he got through. And so we've latched on to competency-based education as a way of getting people through a program faster. So that's the connection to affordable baccalaureate. I'm not quite sure that's true, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But the affordable baccalaureate also has a lot of dependency upon PLA, right? In the sense that if we can somehow give this person a year's worth of credit for a 4-year degree, then we can take that 3 years that are left and charge them 15 grand for that, and we can somehow, and then if they do in competency-based education, they'll breeze through that 3 years in a year and a half. And that'll only cost $10,000 less, and so everybody will be happy. Student will be graduated. We'll have a completer. You know, we'll be on our way to the 60 by 30, and everything will just be grand and hunky-dory, right? Okay. So the affordable baccalaureate actually has a lot of dependency on these two things, right, in order to make this work. Okay, so, and I'll come back to this in a minute, but let me back up a second and talk a little bit about this thing about speed. So I think we have to be careful about this. First of all, if you take a program that now consists of 120, let's take a baccalaureate program, 120 semester credit hours, every course is 3 hours, so your success is measured by completing 40 courses, all right? Now, underneath that is also an assumption that you complete 40 courses successfully. And underneath that is an assumption that you complete courses successfully because you actually know something and can do something. So let's assume all of that for a moment. And then when you get into competency-based education, so you have to then take that 120 hours of courses and you have to figure out what all the competencies are involved in that. And let's say there are 87. So you say to a student, okay, you don't need to finish 40 courses. What you need to do is master 87 competencies. Now in the old course-based system, right, you can go in and you can always sort of he's at a 70% level. Thank you. All right. Then it might actually take a student longer to get through that program than it would if they can average out the good with the bad. So let's be careful about whether we actually think this is going to take less time or not. Now, I would argue that at the end of this, you've actually produced a much better student, by the way. Because if you actually require them to master everything at a 70% level, instead of their ability to sort of average these over the semester and demonstrate 70% mastery in that course, as opposed to a 70% mastery in each of the competencies there, I think you're going to get a better graduate. Business and industry will get a better employee. So this is not a bad thing, by the way, but it is something that we have to think about in terms of, is this going to take less time or not? So if you walk into the program and there's 87 competencies and you don't know any of them, then you could actually wind up taking longer as a student than you would otherwise. Not necessarily, but perhaps. So it's just something to think about. All right? Because also what we peg a lot of this on is the idea that students do know something and we can use prior learning assessment to determine what that is and then give them some credit for it. And I think that that's probably true to, at least to some extent, if you're talking about returning adults. Okay? So the student that's, got out of high school and, maybe they're one of those whose first semester or year in college wasn't all that stellar and they went off and worked for 10 years and they decided to come back to college. For those students, then probably in that 10-year time period, they probably did learn something. And that may very well be applicable to the degree program they want to go into. Okay, so for those students, and that's who we often think about in these terms, right? Then there may be something to being able to accelerate them through the program. But you take a student that just got out of high school that walks into one of these programs, that may not be so easy to do. And a lot of that's going to depend on on their own motivation, their own time that they have to devote to these things, and so on. So something to think about. So funding is the big issue here. Okay? So a lot of people have avoided CBE and PLA both in a big way because of the funding issues. And, so what we do now is we map competencies to courses. All right? So we're still required to do that because your funding from the state is dependent upon, at the community college level, contact hour reimbursement. At the four-year level, it's semester credit hour reimbursement. It's just two different ways to measure essentially the same thing. Okay, but that's what your funding is based on. And it's based on how many you get in there, right? Not how many you get out. So it's based on how many you get in there. So we map competencies to courses, we map those, then we use competencies, then we map the courses rather to contact hours and so forth and fund it. So somehow what we need to do is figure out how to, instead of paying for contact hours, we're going to figure out how to pay for competencies. And this is the part that we haven't quite figured out yet. I think there is some promise in what are called NCBOs. So how many of you are familiar with what I'm talking about? Non-course based, whatever those things, NCB, non-course based options. Yes, thank you. I forgot what we relabeled this stuff. So these things have been around for a long time. All right. Nobody used them much until we figured out how to actually pay for them. I mean, that's really the truth. I saw some data that somebody ran at the coordinating board about this. And before we figured out how to pay for them, almost nobody used these things. Well, and this should not be a shock to anybody, right? Because otherwise, then as an institution, you're totally on your own and trying to figure out how to pay for all this stuff. You get no help from the state then. And while the state's share has dropped, it's still significant enough to pay some attention to. So what we finally did with NCBOs is figure out how to pay for those without having to put a student in a course. Now, I'll be honest with you, in a lot of ways, what we did was we figured out how to equate that stuff to contact hours. Okay? So we still fell back into the same old formula, and a lot of people sat around and spent a lot of time thinking about, so how do we equate these things to contact hours? And they finally did. But what we really need to think about is getting away from that model itself and think about completion instead of enrollment. Okay? And really think about how do we pay for someone who completes rather than someone who enrolls. You know, a provost from a four-year institution, he and I were talking one day about the fact that particularly four-year colleges, but two-year schools do this too. I mean, they're always proposing new programs, right? But one of the things that my division does is we approve all certificate and degree programs in the state of Texas from level 1, or actually CE certificates of 360 hours or more, right on up to PhDs. And we get dozens of these things every month. And he said, well, you know, we primarily get funded based on enrollment. And so as long as we get paid based on enrollment, then we're going to have to try to grow enrollment. And one of the ways we do that is by creating programs. Well, it makes perfect sense. So we need to change the incentives somehow. And to make this work, maybe what we need to do is think about paying on completion rather than on enrollment. Now, what's the downside to that? Oh, good. Y'all don't think there is a downside. That's great. Okay. The downside is, of course, is that if you don't pay until they're finished, what about your startup costs? And what about your operating costs all along? Because your cost of instruction per student is going to be roughly the same whether they finish the course with a passing grade or not in the end. Okay? And so somehow we have to account for the fact that your operating costs don't change just because the student failed or the student passed. And so that's why I have this sort of hybrid model up here. And that is, how do we somehow get to a place where we can both try to cover both of those things? And Ron Sanders is here, but you know, one of the things that TSTC has done is they've gone to what they call their return on investment model. And essentially they get paid for completions and employment. So even worse, they get paid for, in some sense, employment. But
actually sort of the pay delta, really.
Yeah. But one of the things they've run into, and Mike and I have had a conversation or two about this, Mike Reeser, who's the chancellor of that system, one of the things they've run into is that if you're getting paid for everything on the back end, how do you pay for the front end? Now that's that's a simplification of the issue, but it's still an issue nevertheless. So we have to figure this out. I mean, how are we going to do? And you know, the most simplistic part of this, and this has been discussed at the coordinating board in terms of PhD programs, and that is, well, figure out what the average formula funding for doctoral students is, and then give a program half of that up front and give them the other half when the student finishes, as a way of trying to help them cover their operational costs, but then also reward them at the end for completion. All right, student doesn't finish, they don't get the other half. Now, my guess is that a really good model is probably something around that, but maybe not necessarily that. I mean, I think that's a good starting point to talk about this. But if we're ever going to really use competency-based education in the sense that we get away from the notion of semester credit hours and we put it all on the notion of the competencies that are finished, we're going to have to figure out a way to fund this that makes sense to the institutions, that makes sense to you guys, all right? And that folks like Mike can then take that and then figure out how they're going to run their programs on it and pay for them while they're going along. Right? And in a lot of ways, I think that is probably the single biggest stumbling block that we face in making this really widespread is in the funding issue. Okay, so, and if you, have any thoughts about that? That's how you can get a hold of me. Somebody complained to me the other day that I never answer my phone. And I pointed out to him, well, if I'm in the office, I'll, except for one caller. Okay, there is this caller I've been dealing with for 2.5 years now. And you know, and all I have to do is just glance at the phone and I recognize the number. I mean, that's so ingrained. I just look at it, that's so-and-so. I mean, and people be in my office and the phone is ringing and they're like, well, aren't you going to answer that? And no, I'm not. Because I know who that is. And he hasn't figured out yet that what he needs to do is call from a different number. Okay? All right. So, but you know, he's trying to be a college graduate, and so there we go. All right. So, but other than that, I tell him, I said, well, but the thing is, I almost always answer the phone when I'm in my office, unless I'm in a meeting in my office, but I'm rarely in my office, is the problem. So I actually looked at this one time, and you know, like a lot of people, I spend more time in meetings than I do anything else, and which is not terribly productive as a general rule, but you know, it's the way it goes. But if I'm there, I'll answer the phone. Probably the best way to get to me is to send me an email. Now, I will warn you, it may take a few days or sometimes a couple of 3 weeks for me to get back to you, but I will eventually get back to you. And I do look at them, and if it really, you know, if it really looks urgent, then I'll actually contact you sooner than that. But anyway, but if you have thoughts about this, then just let me know. Yeah?
I was just wondering which couple of weeks would it take to get back to
I see. Very good. Yeah, that's great. Oh, yeah. Okay. So she deserves a prize for that. And I'll let you know. So questions or comments?
Well, I was just supposed to ask about the RFP for the Credit for Heroes.
For the
newest RFP for Credit for Heroes.
that is not.
Is there one coming out, or who does that?
It's coming out from the Workforce Commission.
But yeah, TWC is doing that one though this time.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's going to be late on the 19th.
19th, okay.
19th of May? Okay. Jana had asked me to ask
Okay,
you.
that's fine. Yeah, they had the Texas Workforce Commission has been the primary funder and mover behind Credit for Heroes. The coordinating board, we funded some of that for a couple of years through Perkins grants, but TWC has been the primary on that. And Central Texas College, of course. Yep. Okay, any questions or comments? Yeah.
So we were talking about completion instead of enrollment. So how do we assure quality with that model? In other words, at some point, if we're talking about funding for completion, how do we make, well, quality is very important to me. I don't want it to start to become pumping students out just for the simple fact of completion.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the truth of the matter is that if you want to increase your graduation rates, all you have to do is just give everybody an A. And your graduation rates will shoot up through the roof. You know, I had a faculty member once whose withdrawal rate and the failure rate was non-existent. and the withdrawal rate was minuscule. I mean, way out of line compared with anybody else. And so I started looking at the grade distributions in his course, and it turned out that his grade distribution was 75% A's and 25% B's. Well, no wonder nobody was dropping the class. I mean, you either had to die or move out of the state, right, to exit that class. Otherwise, everybody finished. And I mean, and think about, if I'd been in a class where somebody said, well, the worst thing that's going to happen to you is a B. I'm going, well, I'm in. Right? Okay. I took a graduate course one time, and so on a 100-point scale, I failed the first test, but it actually turned out to be the third highest grade in the class, which was sort of mind-boggling all by itself. But I went to the professor, and he says, and it was one of these sort of odd things. There was like 6 graduate students in there, and then there was 25 undergraduates in there. And I was talking to him, and he said, well, you're a graduate student. He said, look, so the worst thing that's going to happen will be 3 A's and 3 B's. I'm going, now let me make sure I got this straight. He said, oh yeah, don't worry about all stuff. And I thought, well, I'm not going to. And I didn't. But then I asked him, I said, well, what about the undergraduates? He said, oh, no, they're on their own. Like, no, they make an F, they're going to make an F. So it was a very strange thing. But, the whole psychology for me changed when he said, the worst that's going to happen to you is you get a B. Now, in graduate school, C is a failure. But the distinction between an A and a B, nobody really knows as a general rule. At least they didn't in the department I was in. So it was okay. But you raise a really interesting question about this, and that is, and someone asked me about it. I was presenting on the 60 by 30 plan somewhere, and we were talking about completion and attainment and the fact that we want 60% of all 25 to 34-year-olds to have some kind of credential in the year 2030 and all that kind of stuff. And he made the remark that in reading, and apparently he had actually read through the Higher Education Strategic Plan word for word, and he said there is no mention of quality in this anywhere. And he's right about that. And we ignore that to our own detriment. And so I think we always have to keep in mind that whatever we do with all this, we still have to make sure that students know something and can do something when they exit. And that they know and do what we fully expect them to do, at least up to the level of proficiency that we think that they'll then be productive and able to function at that next level, whatever that is. And I think that's something that we sort of need to reiterate all the time and make sure we don't lose sight of. So when I present on the Higher Education Strategic Plan, I've gotten in this habit now of sort of ending all of it by saying, look, and keep in mind that even if we reach all of these goals, if the people we're graduating can't do something and don't know anything, then we've still failed miserably. So it's a point well taken, and it's one that I think that the institutions are going to have to really take it upon themselves to make sure that the quality and the rigor is always there. And then we're going to have to, and we're also going to have administrations and boards and coordinating boards and accrediting bodies and stuff who then who recognize that and then don't start putting a lot of pressure on to complete back here. And there's a very careful balancing act with that, I think. But it's a very good point. And there's one, and then Stacy.
Hi, I'm Beth Doyle. I'm with CALE, Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about incentivizing and competency-based education and your thinking on those competencies connecting to employer needs. So, I see a lot in this activity in higher ed of let's take our existing program and then map it to competencies from our courses. But what about the sort of check back to the industry, and what are you seeing in terms of what are those the right competencies, I guess is the question.
Yeah, and I think you raise a good point, and I'll come at this through the back door. One of the goals of the 60 by 30 is this goal about marketable skills, and that's the idea that no matter what your major is, you actually learn something in that major that you can take to a lot of different employers perhaps and use. When I present the plan, I always use my own personal example of statistics, all right? So, I mean, I said earlier I'm not much of a math person, but the truth is that when I was going through political science programs at both the undergraduate and graduate level, I took a fair amount of statistics courses and actually learned something about it. That was also the course where I actually failed the midterm, but and he you know, the interesting thing to me, well, and the interesting thing to me was he said, well, you know, I looked at your test and he said, you understand the statistics. He said, your problem is you don't remember enough algebra to get the right answer. And I said, well, you know, really about all I remember about algebra is you got to do the same thing to both sides. But you know, but beyond that, I don't know what to do to both sides is part of the problem. And I said, but I, you know, and he actually, I mean, he actually went through one of the problems that we had on this thing, and he said, yeah, he said, look, he said, your statistics is fine. He says, but when you got down here and you needed algebra to get the right answer, he says, that's where you fell apart. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, you're right about that. And I said, well, do I need to go back and take some remedial algebra then? And he said, no. He said, we got programs that do that for you. He said, so at some point you need to worry about this stuff. I thought, okay, this is good. But I did learn enough statistics, and I tell people that one of the jobs I had when I was working my way through college was at a plastics plant that made trash bags. Okay, and I realized years later that the statistics that I learned in political science programs, I learned enough about that I could have gone to that plastics plant and easily run their quality control department. Because statistics is all about knowing how to sample and then how to draw the right inferences from those samples. So I actually picked up a marketable skill. Nobody told me I was doing that because all of the statistics was around political science stuff. You know, what are voters doing and interest groups and what have you. So in that sense, then we're trying to connect those competencies that you learn in a program to employer needs. Now, the other part of this is that employers are notoriously good about telling us that we're not graduating people with the right stuff. They're notoriously bad about telling us what the right stuff is. I mean, it's very difficult, right? I mean, you experience this all the time, right? And so, you know, you go to an employer and you say, well, what do you want these guys to be able to do? And they, well, you know, they need to be able to, you know, they need to be able to, and we always get this thing, they need to be able to read and write a little bit, so they got to be able to communicate somehow. They got to be able to do some critical thinking, whatever that is. What they really mean is problem solving, which is related to but a little different than critical thinking. And then they need to learn how to, you know, and then work in teams, right? In other words, they need to learn how to get along with each other. And then they'll start talking about it, and they need to learn how to show up on time, and you know, and stuff like that. I had an employee once who when you told him he was supposed to be at work at 8 o'clock, he thought that if he left his driveway at 8 o'clock, he was on time. And he sincerely believed this. I mean, I finally realized that he wasn't BSing me at all. He really believed that. Now, I disabused him of the notion as soon as I could, but it was like, are you serious? And he, yeah, I mean, isn't that the way the world works, kind of thing? It's like, well, yeah, I don't know where you've been, but not in this one anyway. But that's the kind of advice we typically get from employers, and it's very difficult to nail down those specific skills. Now, you know, ONET and TSTC has done a lot of work on trying to identify what workplace skills are, and then how do you map those to the learning outcomes and the competencies that are being demonstrated in a program. So I think there's some progress being made in that regard, and I think it's important. But I think we also need to keep in mind that people change careers a lot, and that, you know, whatever the commissioner is fond of talking about this book that came out not too long ago, which I must admit I haven't read, but he tells me about it all the time, so I figure I don't need to read it, right? I just take his word for it and move on. But the book talks about the fact that, you know, what we all know is that, you know, for a long time now we've been told that 20 years from now, a third of the jobs that exist today won't exist then. because things change. Well, in this book, it makes the argument that pace of that change is actually going to be much accelerated. That instead of a third of the jobs not being the same in 10 or 15 years, it'll be 2/3 of the jobs won't be the same. So part of what education needs to do is figure out how you train a person for a job, but then how do you also train them for their lifetime, And so I used to put it in terms of, we need to stop thinking about how we're going to train a person for the career of their lifetime and figure out how we're going to train them for a lifetime of careers. And a lot of that goes back to what we generally conceive of as general education, and for people like me, it's the old liberal arts. And the old liberal arts included a very strong dosage of science and math, by the way. People sometimes tend to think that the liberal arts are just the humanities and the social and behavioral sciences, and they're not. It also includes math and science as a part of that. And so, part of it is how do you give them the skills they need to make those adaptations? So, so part of what we need to be doing is trying to better track what it is that they want, along with how do we also equip them for the next job. Because I was at a meeting at I think it was sponsored by the Lieutenant Governor's Office, and it was about P-TECH, which I'm sure some of you heard of. And the thing I was struck by was the people there representing employers. Their deal was, basically what they were saying is, we have a job, and we need you to train a person for that job. And if you can do that, then we're going to be happy. And part of my concern is, we can do that, but if we do that, then what happens when that job disappears, moves overseas, whatever? All right? So what's going to happen to that person? And if that person doesn't have some background knowledge and skills to make some adaptations, then we may be back training that person for the next job that comes along. And I think, and while there's some value in that, and for a lot of people that's what they need to get started, so there's a delicate balancing act too. How do you get that person to where they need to be at the moment? Because a lot of people, they just need to go make a living. And for right now, they can't be concerned with what's going to happen to them 5 or 10 years from now. They're trying to figure out how to pay the rent this week. And so, we also have to be very cognizant of and very sympathetic to that in dealing with it. So there's a balancing act that we don't have, or that we haven't really figured out yet. And I don't know what that is, but we do need to do a better job of trying to figure out what it is that business and industry really want. And then how do we combine that with an education to produce somebody that can go do that job, but they then also have the ability to make those transformations they're going to need to make down the line, perhaps. So.
Who was the person over here?
I think I'm going to pass, and I have like 3 questions down. I'm just going to tell you.
Okay.
Okay.
So Amardeep had a question.
And in a couple of weeks, you'll get answers.
I'll take my chance.
Now, that may be 2 weeks in October, but okay.
So my name is Amardeep. I'm from Austin Community College, and my comment is directed at you, Beth. Sadly, we're presenting at the same time, so you can't come to mine, and I can't come to yours. We're filming both. So, in answer to your question about industry, we developed a very successful CBE program. We launched it in fall 2013. And my advice to anybody going into CBEs, involve industry before you even start making your curriculum. And what Rex said is very true. You have to find that midline, that balance between, are we training the people for a particular job, or are we training them for employability in an industry? And what we're doing is training them for employability in an industry. We have a very strong industry advisory board. We have partnerships with 165 companies now. Who are hiring our interns and who are advising us on our curriculum. So that's how we are ensuring that what we are delivering is what industry wants.
Yeah, but even then, you're dependent. It's largely dependent upon hoping that 20 years from now, that industry is still there, and that industry may be gone in 20 years. Yeah, so it's difficult.
one of the questions we ask our industry advisory board members is, tell us what's coming 5 years from now. Tell us what's coming 6 years from now. And our advisory board is pretty robust. We have a hiring professional on there who can actually look at the trends. We have technical developers. We have executives, people from the E-suite in that, the C-suite in that advisory board. So it's proven really good for us. So if you want to talk about it after the conference, we can.
Yeah, and that's definitely a step in the right direction, by the way. I mean, I don't want to discount that at all. But at the same time, I think we also need to be careful about the fact that industries disappear. And for a lot of different reasons, and some are connected to the industry, some are connected to other things. I spent 8 years in Midland as the VP for instruction there, and so before I went to the coordinating board. And so I was out there during the latest boom, and I sold my house there just at the right time. I finally made money on a house. Okay, but if 3 months later, I'd probably still be paying on this thing. Okay, but I was out there when everybody in that industry out there kept saying, "This is the boom that will never end." Okay, oil was $150 a barrel. Oh yeah, it'll bounce up and down a little bit, but no, this boom is never going to end. This is, between the Chinese and the Indians, their demand for energy is going to be so great over the next 500,000 years or whatever that we'll be, we're going to be pumping and at high prices until every last drop of it's sucked out of the ground. Right? And right now, if you went out to the Permian Basin, the only rigs that are still drilling are the ones that were started before the bust. There is hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment, and they literally stack these things up, and they're just sitting out there hoping that they don't rust away before the next boom happens. And and the interesting thing is the energy industry then also drives a lot of what else happens. So why was manufacturing coming back to the United States for a while? Mainly because, or two major reasons. One was the cost of labor overseas is going up. Right? The Chinese, who used to be quite willing to work for next to nothing, aren't that quite willing anymore. So prices are going, cost of labor is going up overseas. And when you couple that with the decrease in the cost in transportation, it's suddenly very cost effective to bring that manufacturing back to the United States. Okay. Or actually an increase for them in transportation, I'm sorry. Well, now we have a decrease in transportation. And so it's not quite as cost effective now to bring it back as it was before, so a lot of that activity has slowed down. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the manufacturing we've brought back doesn't look anything like the manufacturing that left in the first place. It is a very, very different world than it used to be. So there's all kinds of, and it really is a delicate balancing act, because most students go to college to get a better job, right? The latest study from UCLA does this study on a periodic basis, and the latest study shows that 88% of all of their respondents, when asked why they went to college, was to get a better job. Right? That's why I went to college. Right? One summer when I was in high school, me and a buddy of mine, he told this guy that he worked at a car wash. All right. And so the car wash guy decided that he was going to repave his, the asphalt around the car wash and all this kind of stuff. And so this friend of mine convinced me that he and I could bust all this asphalt up. And so we did. So we spent all summer long busting up asphalt with pickaxes and stuff. And I thought, I don't ever want to do this again. And my father, who in his own fashion was a very wise man, said to me upon getting home one day after doing this all day long, and he said, "Well, son, you don't get an education, you could just do that for the rest of your life." And I'm thinking, well, crap, I don't want to do this. And so, I'll be honest with you, I went to college because, he told me you can either go to work full time or you can go to college. And I thought, well, I've been working part-time since I was 12, and I haven't particularly enjoyed it. And so I don't see why working full-time is going to be any better. In college, there's girls there. How bad can this be, right? So I went to college. I'm a first-generation college student, so neither one of my parents actually knew much about college. All I knew was what my sister, who was older than me, told me. And I thought, okay, anywhere but Sam Houston State will be okay, because that's where she went. But but we do have an obligation, I think, to students to be able to equip them so that they can go to work. And then they can at least go to work in a field that's at least related to what their major was in some way. And that can be very broad, by the way. I mean, one of the things I've learned a lot about is that a lot of humanities and social behavioral science majors have a lot of job prospects in things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a job prospect, because they learn the skills of reading and writing and critical thinking and so forth. And they can apply those to a lot of different things. So anyway, so I think we're out of time, right? Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.